Well, moving on to other things that Jefferson did, it's interesting to see what he did, for example, when you get into 1803, because as chief executive, he has to negotiate treaties with Indian tribes. One of the treaties he negotiated in 1803 was with the Kaskaskia Indian tribe. In that treaty, Jefferson, federal government, provided federal funds to send Christian ministers to the Indians. We're not talking about faith-based programs. We're talking about Jefferson actually doing this. And at the bottom of the treaty is signed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who was the Secretary of State back then. We're talking about sending Christian missionaries into the Indians at federal expense? Yeah, Thomas Jefferson did that.
Well, these claims that Jefferson used federal funds to pay for missionaries to go evangelize the Indians and to build churches for them to worship in after they were converted to Christianity would give the impression that Jefferson was trying to convert these Indians to Christianity, right? Wrong. The Kaskaskia Indians that this treaty was made with were already Catholic and had been for many generations. They were converted by French missionaries in the late 1600s. It was the Kaskaskia who asked for these religious provisions, and there was no reason for the government not to agree to them. Our Bill of Rights didn't apply to sovereign nations, which is, of course, what the Indian tribes were. The treaty negotiators were perfectly free to agree to any religious provision requested by another nation, as long as it didn't have the effect of establishing religion among the citizens of the United States. This was made very clear in the House of Representatives back in 1796, when the very unpopular Jay Treaty prompted a debate about the treaty-making power that went on for weeks and covered just about every conceivable aspect of treaties. Among the provisions that the Kaskaskia asked for in exchange for the 9 million acres of land they were ceding was $300 to build a church and the salary of their priest for 7 years. That was it. One church, one priest. But Barton turns it into plural missionaries and plural churches to make it sound like Jefferson was making some sort of widespread effort to evangelize the Indians, and of course his audience eats it up. Now, Jefferson signed over 40 Indian treaties while he was president, and this 1803 one with the Kaskaskia was the only one to include any religious provisions whatsoever. In fact, out of the hundreds of Indian treaties made in the first 50 years after the ratification of the First Amendment, only 9, including the Kaskaskia Treaty, contained provisions related in any way to religion, and even these were typically just provisions compensating either the Indians or missionaries who had established missions on the land being ceded for the buildings they were losing in the treaties. And another interesting thing about the Kaskaskia Treaty is that Jefferson, in his address to Congress that year, was going to include what the exact provisions of the treaty were. But when his Secretary of State, James Madison, looked at the draft of his speech, he advised Jefferson not to mention the religious provisions. Madison had been in that debate back in 1796, where it was agreed that the religious provisions in a treaty did not violate the First Amendment, but he feared that some people, quote, may see in it a principle not according with the exemption of religion from the civil power. So contrary to the revisionist claims that nobody back in those days would have seen anything wrong with federal funding of religion, James Madison was worried that even this few $100s of government spending on religion in a treaty that gained the United States 9 million acres of land would make people uneasy that the government wasn't strictly adhering to the First Amendment. So, in his speech, Jefferson didn't specify the church and the priest. He just called them other articles of their choice.